It's just water in this now. But I've been enjoying my morning coffee in this, even though it's like incredibly small and inconvenient because I have to get up and refill a lot. But I got these mugs a couple summers ago at a flea market in Ontario, and I love them, and I never use them, so I'm embracing it. I am embracing all the things that I love because the spring energy is so high right now in my life. I am just having the best time, and I just can't wait to be able to go outside and read. Last summer, I really discovered my love for reading in the park, and I'm just really excited to do that. But speaking of books, today you have clicked on this video knowing that we are going to talk about all the books that I read in February. I loved my February reads. I had such a good reading month. I feel like we're gonna get to it, but I've probably read the best book I will have read all year. However, I'm gonna go in order. I'm actually referencing my reading journal, which is super helpful for me because it helps me remember my thoughts, frankly. I tend to write a spread for all of the books with just little notes and whatnot in them. And it's just like a really good reference point for me to remember how I felt about a book and what stood out to me. Go in order of the books that I've read. I actually read a lot of physical books this month. They are all behind me. And I listened to one audiobook. So let's dive into it. I hope you're cozy. If not, get cozy. And let's talk about the books that I read in February. Starting with the first book that I read in February. This is Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. This is set in Northern Iceland in 1829, and it follows the last people, in particularly the last woman to be put to death for crime in Iceland. It is based on a real life story of this woman who is sent to live with a family during her last days. And it was incredibly gripping. I ultimately ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars because the writing was incredibly visceral, and it really felt like the Icelandic landscape came to life. This is actually, I think, probably the first book I've ever read that was set in Iceland, and I have such a love for Iceland. I really want to get there one day. I've actually been in love with Iceland since I was a teenager. It is actually probably one of 2 of my life goals to get to Iceland, and this book really made me feel like I was there. And I really love historical stories that make you feel like you are there in that time, in that place, and a lot of that can come down to atmospheric writing, and this book definitely has stellar atmospheric writing. I highly recommend, first of all, if you want to read anything set in Iceland, but second of all, just to read during the height of winter. It's very claustrophobic in many ways. The next book, continuing on in my Lord of the Rings series reading, was the very first book of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. It's kind of funny because I'm actually reading this with my best friend, and she has all 3 books in one book, so I feel like such a cheat marking these down as individual books, but they're individual books according to my bookshelf. However, I could totally see how this is a thoroughly cohesive story because I actually just finished reading The Two Towers, spoiler alert, for my March Reads wrap up, and it definitely is just an ongoing story. So what can I say? What can I possibly say about The Lord of the Rings that hasn't already been said, other than the fact that if you like fantasy and you haven't read The Lord of the Rings, you should absolutely read The Lord of the Rings. Some things that surprised me, because this is actually my first time reading Lord of the Rings. What surprised me about this? I think the pacing surprised me the most about this story because it is a lot slower than the movies, which it's such an obvious thing to say, but it really takes its time. And there are moments of very, very slow progression mixed in with incredibly epic, gripping moments that you just can't help but race to the end of the chapter. The other thing that really surprised me about this, I'm saying surprised, but it's not like it actually surprised me because I have read The Hobbit and I've watched the movies so many times, but this series is filled with music and poems and poetry and verse, and I just feel like I want a Lord of the Rings musical where they just burst into song randomly like they do in the book. I really enjoyed it. It was a very pleasant surprise. Not really a surprise. One thing that I've been doing that, again, I highly recommend if you are gonna give this a try is, this is my morning book and I wake up really early, and so I'm not always prepared to read right away. So what I have been doing is I've been reading alongside the audiobook, which I did with The Hobbit, and I loved it, and I'm loving it again. It's a different narrator. I actually can't remember the narrator's name. I actually don't know the narrator's name because I borrowed it from Libby. But it's fantastic. It really makes the story come alive when you can hear the characters' voices and when you can hear the songs, and it's just a really great way to like read this story. My favorite part about this book is the nature writing, the world building, the way that you feel like you are in Middle Earth, and how beautiful Middle Earth is and must be, and how I just long to walk through it in probably a different direction than what they're walking. But I love it. I love it so much. The last thing I will say is that Sam, he is probably my favorite. Sam is definitely still my favorite character. I love him so much, and I love him in the book all the more. I think he's just lovable. I also love Aragorn. I just can't wait to follow through on their journey. I am now on the last one, and I am so excited to see how this ends. Moving on to the next one. What is the next book I read? Oh, this was an audio. So I'm gonna pop up the cover right here. I actually listened to Daisy Jones and the Six on audio. What did I ultimately give this one? I gave this book a generous, I will say, 3 out of 5 stars. It's not that it was a bad book. It wasn't bad at all. It's just that it was like fine. I don't think I would have liked this book as much had I been actually reading it as opposed to listening to the audiobook, because the audiobook is a full cast audiobook, and it feels like a podcast when you're listening to it. It really does. You really do feel like it is a documentary of sorts. So what is the book about? The book is about a band in the 1970s. It follows their formation as well as their breakup, and it has some really stellar lead characters. Daisy Jones, the other guys, I don't even remember their name. I honestly feel like this was a book that's like all vibes and not a whole lot of anything else. So if you are into the vibes of like 1970s rock star life, if you like Almost Famous, which is one of my favorite movies and the reason why I picked up this book, I do think that like this is worth the read because it definitely brings you into that time period. What are some positives? I like the way this story was told. It is told in a way that it's almost told like a script of a music documentary. Which I have no idea how to like envision what this looks like on an actual page. So if you've read the book, let me know, because I feel like that would be fascinating. So I really did like that. I felt like it was creative, and I did like the characters, although I don't really feel like I got much depth from the story. I think the story is what it is. It's what you expect it to be. I am probably going to watch the show. I'm not like racing to watch the show, but I probably will watch it because I feel like with the music it would just come alive even more, possibly, and with like really good acting maybe. Oh, Billy. His name was Billy. I wrote it down here. See, this is why it's good to have the reading journal. It was good vibes. It was a good vibes book, but it kind of just is what it is, and that's not a bad thing, but that's just, it wasn't entirely as moved as I wanted to be. So all in all, pretty decent. Oh, okay, what's next? Let's see. Oh boy. Okay, it's the big one. It was the big one, kind of. The second biggest one. Crime and Punishment by my man Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky? I have been wanting to read this book for a long time. It has been on my like Russian to read shelf. It is definitely a goal of mine to read more of his work. How did I feel about this? I ultimately gave this, I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. That feels pretty harsh, but also kind of accurate. It may have been a 3.5 out of 5. I was not as enthralled as I wanted to be with this work. I think the first part was probably my favorite part, the lead up. So if you don't know what this is about, this is about a young man, Raskolnikov, who commits a crime, and then the rest of the story deals with the aftermath of his conscience and coming to terms with what he did and essentially the metaphorical punishment of the crime that he committed. And it is a philosophical exploration of consciousness and conscience and morality and choices and all of these wonderful things that I think I just wanted ultimately more from. I really loved the writing. I thought the writing was phenomenal. I really loved the characters. Some of these characters were just so wonderful. Razumikin, I believe is how you pronounce his friend's name, who ultimately ended up being one of my favorite characters and served as kind of opposition to our main character, who was really struggling with his goodness, but Razumikin is quite a good character, and he just really leapt off the page for me. I think my biggest issue with this book is I wanted more redemption within the storyline. I felt like it didn't explore the things that I wanted it to explore, and obviously that's just my opinion, and obviously I think if I were studying this I would find even more within the pages, but I just think that it wasn't the part of the story that I wanted to read. I wanted to read more of his redemption. I think my biggest issue was ultimately the arc of Razulnikov. I feel like he wasn't the character that I kind of wanted him to be. And a lot of the points that were made in this story I didn't necessarily agree with when it came to the idea of like great men making great decisions and great choices and necessity of crime and all these things. However, that has not put me off reading Dostoevsky in the future. I have more from him that I definitely want to read, and his writing is phenomenal. And obviously, as you can tell by the tabs, I did find a lot that was worthy in this story. I was pleasantly surprised at how much I loved his writing, but it's just the plot of this story that I didn't necessarily love. I think that a 3 out of 5 star is probably pretty harsh. That's what I did. That's what I listed it as, so that's what it is. But I think for me, sometimes the more I sit with books, the more I realize that I like them. But honestly, even the worst Russian book is still still better for me than like the average book. Like even a bad Russian classic is still just like so immensely readable and enjoyable. So it does have that going for it. The next one is The Idiot by Elif Batuman. My birthday is in February, and for my birthday I went to Ottawa to visit a bunch of my friends who are all in Ottawa, and had a wonderful time. And my best friend actually surprised me with a bookstore tour, believe it or not. And these last 2 books I got on this bookstore tour. So I have broken my book buying ban, but we are back in the book buying ban. However, it was for my birthday, and my birthday I was always going to allow myself to buy myself books, as well as my trip coming up. However, this is a book actually that my best friend got me. This has been on my list for a while, and this follows a Harvard undergraduate student, Celine, who is so funny. She's so funny. This is set in 1995, and the first part of this book had me laughing out loud. I love the tone that this book is written in. It is precisely my kind of dry humor. It's really funny and hard-hitting in the best way. I ultimately ended up giving this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. So it follows Celine, who is the daughter of Turkish immigrants, and she goes to Harvard, and it's basically just like her journey as like an undergrad. It follows her kind of relationship with a man named Ivan. And it's a bit of a troubled relationship, in the sense that he's not a very nice guy, and she is deeply in love with him. And the way that Elif wrote this relationship was so good. It was probably the best representation of this type of relationship that I've read in a really long time. You know, that feeling of really, really being invested in someone who just is not invested in you. The feeling of being kind of strung along. Almost the feeling of being at the whim of someone else's ego. All of that is encapsulated in this book. And I stupidly, as an idiot, didn't realize that this book also references a lot of Russian literature, which I just really, really enjoyed. Obviously, it was so much fun to read a book about someone who relates their life to Russian literature in a way that just like is so funny and so relatable. When I was looking this book up on Goodreads, actually, one of the blurbs I think totally summarizes this book in a way that I probably wouldn't be able to do it justice. And it's a portrait of the artist as a young woman, a novel not just about discovering, but inventing oneself. And I really liked that. I really felt like it was a portrait of a young woman who is just entering university and trying to figure out who she is and what she wants to do with her life. And it was really well done. I really did enjoy it. I think I knocked it down a few stars because it did kind of drag on. The first part of the book was so funny and so enjoyable, but then towards the end I kind of just wanted it to wrap up a little bit quicker. Okay, I'm gonna take a big old sip of water before I talk about this book, because if you watched my last vlog, you would have heard me raving about this book. This is Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath by Heather Clark. Oh my goodness. So let me quickly tell you a little bit about the magic that this book is to me. Oh my gosh, where do I start? Okay, I'm gonna start with talking about how much I love Sylvia Plath. I love Sylvia Plath so very much. She is one of those writers that is a formative writer for me. I believe I've talked about her a number of times in videos. I just love her. I fell in love with her writing when I was 16, and I read The Bell Jar in high school for a book report, and it just was amazing, and I love her words. And for a while I've wanted to return back to her work and reread it, but I find her a little triggering and it's a little bit difficult to read her when you're not in the best headspace. But her words are so and she just like, oh, she's phenomenal. Anyway, so there's that background. But with this book in particular, so as I told you, my friend surprised me on a bookstore tour across Ottawa. We went to a number of bookstores. I think like ultimately when we ended up going to like 4, and it was a mixture of independent bookstores, used bookstores, and then at the very end we were going to go to Indigo, which is Canada's largest bookstore chain, if you don't know. It's kind of like a Barnes & Noble in the US. At the very end, we were gonna go to Indigo because her and her partner wanted to pick up some books, and at this point I was done buying books. I actually was looking for a Tolkien cookbook because I really want a Tolkien cookbook, but they didn't have one there. And so we were walking through Indigo, and I went to the poetry section because I was looking for Dorothy Parker, actually, randomly. And they didn't have Dorothy Parker, but in the poetry section, they had this book. And it was this book, and it was spaced out. And I was like, oh my gosh, I picked it up, and I looked at it, and I was like, wow, this looks amazing. Like, I've never heard of this. It's a Pulitzer Prize finalist, which is always like a really good indication for me that it's a good book. I tend to really enjoy Pulitzer selections. I don't know why. It's kind of the only award that I feel like I guess like maybe the Booker. Anyway, that's a digression for another time. So I was like, okay, I'm not gonna buy this book because there's no way that I'm gonna read it, and it's probably super, super expensive because a book like this in Canada I would imagine would be like $50. It's massive, and it is $26 Canadian, $20 US, which is like the price. Like, this book was $23 Canadian. It's crazy. Anyway, so I was like, hey, I'm buying it. So this was the last book that I bought, and I thought about it for days. I was so excited to read this book. For some reason, I just really felt like I was ready to like read Sylvia Plath again and read her story. And guys, this was an amazing book. 5 out of 5 stars. I can't believe a book like this was written. Heather Clark is a master. I can't believe that this was a biography and a nonfiction. I truly didn't know that a nonfiction book could make me feel this way. I'm not going into too much detail because I did, again, rave about it in my previous book, but Heather Clark weaves Sylvia Plath's own writing in with her history in a way that just like makes Sylvia Plath jump off of the page. There were so many poems within this book that I hadn't read yet, and so many lines from Sylvia Plath that I hadn't experienced that I got to experience. And I've been saying that this book feels like being able to read your favorite book for the first time again, which I don't know if you know what I'm talking about when I say that, but I don't know, like, have you ever read a book and you're like, man, I wish I could read that again for the first time? This book gave me that gift of being able to read Sylvia Plath for the first time, and it was such a blessing. I highlighted so many amazing lines from her poetry. Like one of the first ones is, I write only because there is a voice within me that will not be still. So many lines and so many instances where I just felt so seen within Sylvia Plath's story as well. It's an incredibly sad story if you don't know it, but one of the things that really persuaded me to pick this book up is in the introduction, Heather Clark talks about how Sylvia Plath's death by suicide is really the only thing people talk about when they talk about her story. They don't talk about her as a writer and how brilliant she is. And she says the line, actually, I guess she writes the line, she doesn't say the line, but in the introduction, she writes, I have tried to recover what Plath gave to us rather than what she gave up. Which she did. Like, she absolutely did. If you are at all a fan of Sylvia Plath, I would highly recommend picking this up. Like, I think you'd have to be like an Uber fan because it is a very long book. The actual story is like 900 pages, but it didn't feel like that for me. I read this book in less than 2 weeks. I could not stop thinking about it, and it is hands down probably the best book that I've read all year. And that's really all I can say about it because I'm so in my feelings with this story that I love it. And it has ignited a urge to read more of Plath's work this year, and I definitely am going to do that. So Red Comet, 5 out of 5 glorious stars. I didn't know that I could feel this way again about a book. And isn't that the best feeling in the world? I feel like as a reader I'm always chasing that high of when you are reading a book that is just so good, and so uniquely good, and something that, like, you know, is such a unique feeling that you are experiencing this connection to this work and no one else around you is. And I just think that that is so special, and it's something that I chase. And man, if I could guarantee that like every book would make me feel that way. Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. I guess it wouldn't make it as special, but I haven't felt this way about a book since War and Peace, and that is a very big deal for me. It is definitely a book that I would put on the list of life-changing books because of the fact that I got to experience my favorite writer all over again, and that was a very special feeling. So that's it. Oh, I just knocked the camera. That's it. Those are all the books that I read in February. I can't believe it. Again, it feels like a really big reading month, but it was just great. It was so great, and I love books. So thank you so very much for watching. I will catch you in the next video. I hope you have a wonderful day wherever you are.